You were raised in the rural village of Bushbuck Ridge. How
Yes.
did your upbringing shape your values and long-term leadership philosophy?
In various ways. I was born into what you might call an extended family. I was brought up by a double parentage, my grandparents and my parents. And I did not have siblings from the beginning, but they came after me. I come from a family of seven. But then my father's younger brother also stayed or lived largely with my grandparentage. My father's cousin, who had emigrated to Zimbabwe and came back and had no real base, came with his children to stay with us. So, in a sense, I was brought up in what you might call an extended family. But as an adult, I actually balk at the idea that you can extend or contract a family. So my sense is that you either have a generous sense of the family or you have a stingy one. And I choose to have a generous one. So I grew up knowing that there's the bit that is there will be shared by quite many. And I learned to be pretty generous and accommodating because of that milieu. So that was my conception of kinship, not the so-called nuclear family, but the family as generously defined. So part of the influence came from my grandfather, who could not countenance laziness. In fact, what I remember him for was his insistence that we should not rest unless we were tired. That those who were that actually rest is a state of mind, state of physique that you earn by dint of being tired. That if you rest without being tired, you're not resting, you're being lazy, you're being indolent. So that's what I inherited from my grandfather, diligence, working real hard. And in part of our Istagazelo says actually we are the people who rest when they go to sleep. For as long as you are awake, you must be doing something. So that also imbued me with a sense of diligence and dedication. Where discipline was concerned, we were effectively prevailed upon or taught to wake up before sunrise. As boys, by the time my grandfather woke up, he wanted to know if the cattle and the sheep were actually fine. So as the sun rises, we had to report that before we took the cattle into the grazing pastures, and or proceed to school, depending on at what stage of my life that was. And the young girls, by the time their mothers and grandmothers woke up, they should have been to the fountain to fetch some water. So we grew up in an environment that encouraged that kind of discipline and dedication and role, and playing a role that was actually contributory to the welfare of the family. And my grandmother also would scold us, whenever we did not do things right. She would say, "Auna zana." In other words, you don't have a zana in Shangan is 100 ikulu. So she would say, "Auna kulu." In other words, you don't have your 100% faculties. And then if you do well, she would say you got 100. So we competed for earning hundreds from my grandmother. So all of that actually did some contribution, made some contribution in bringing me up. Later on, when I was able to write in the late 50s and early 60s, I exchanged letters with my father, and he insisted that I should do so in English. So what he typically did in replying to my to my letter, he would make corrections to my letter and then respond to it, send my own letter and his response back to me. With the result that by the time I went to high school, many of my English teachers could not correct my grammar. They could add content and stylistic things, but grammatically they couldn't correct anything because of this relationship that I had with my father. In that peri-urban, if you like, or rustic environment, he had been to sort of mission school, and then therefore, his command of the language was fairly commendable.
It's an interesting story you've just led us on, and props to your father for having such a mentorship role in your career. So I just want to get into this aspects of your career, successful career as a whole. You've worn many hats, business leader, academic, and a farmer. Which moment stand out as pivotal?
Well, there are several, but I'll focus on one. The one that was truly pivotal was effectively pivoting from academia to business. When I was doing my second degree at the University of Limpopo, at the time it was called University of the North, I was president of the Psychology Society, and the theme of my presidency was decolonizing the African mind using psychology as your weapon. And I called to question a number of things at the time. Apartheid was still very vicious. And the students actually did like that a lot. But at the same time, I was also chairman of the Choral Society. And as chairman of the Choral Society, I kind of insisted that we should, there's no harm in us singing Western, sophisticated compositions, compositions by Mozart, by Handel, by Tchaikovsky, and Mendelssohn, and all of those kinds of people. But I insisted that we sing our own songs as well, and that if we don't have them, we must compose them. But fortunately, there were a few that were liberatory in content. The lyrics were liberatory. So I insisted that we sing those. So that, in combination with what I advocated as president of the Psychology Society, put me into trouble with the authorities of the time. And in 1974, you may recall, if you have studied a bit of contemporary history, that Mozambique achieved its democracy. And we celebrated the Frelimo achievement of that democracy. So the students, amongst other things, quoted what I used to say been using psychology as a liberator and using music as a liberator. So the authorities at the time just thought I was an instigator. So during that time, I was also a member of the Black Academic Staff Association, which was chaired by one Professor Mushenkondo, who has been my mentor from 1970 to last year. He unfortunately died last year after we co-authored or co-collated a book titled The South African Handbook of Agency, Freedom and Justice. So in September of 1974, he was fired. And
Mm.
in December of the same year, I was also fired. So that's where the pivoting from academia to the
Mm.
business sector actually happened. So I was fired for those activities. And I had to then start looking for a job, and I had to go home. One of the things I dreaded a lot was, what will my father say when, in fact, I was beginning to be a promising student of psychology. I would soon be doing my master's, soon doing my doctorate, and perhaps, develop as a psychologist and a lecturer or a professor. But when I got home, my father actually surprised me. He looked at me for a while, and I was freezing inside. And he said, and so, expected me to explain, why I was fired. And even before I could explain, he said, no, no, you don't have to worry much about explaining. I know you will bounce back. I know you are resilient. And indeed, I then deviated into business. And that was a defining moment, being fired from lectureship and um, uh, having to seek new employment in industry. My only preparation for industry was my study of industrial psychology. I did not do a BCom like others who actually prepared for business that way. So yeah, that I must say was a defining moment, that it was pivotal. And as fate would have it, I developed fairly well in business, and the same university that fired me in 1974 invited me to deliver a graduation address in 1984. And then in 1987, they invited me to join the university council. And in 2007, they invited me to become their chancellor, succeeding the late President Mandela, who was chancellor at the time. So went full circle from being fired as a culprit of sorts to actually a good number of years later, in 2007, being invited as chancellor. So, all of those are somewhat defining moments, but the true defining moments was my being fired in 1974, and thus pivoting from academia to business.
There's a good book by a guy called Jannie Mouton, um, the owner of PSG.
Yes,
It's called, it's titled When They Fired Me. So I'm trying to relate that perspective when he actually got fired in his role, in his business venture,
yes,
when he was executive in that big industry and stuff like that. So I'm just trying to relate that trauma you experienced, and that
yeah,
which helped your secretary or your mindset, and when you transitioned and to your executive roles you've accomplished in your career.
correct. And I happen to know Jannie Mouton.
Mm.
Uh, I actually had, my wife and I had lunch with him and his wife in Stellenbosch. But as business leaders, sharing views, sharing ideas. And I'm aware of the book as well.
You've long championed ethical leadership in both the public and private sector. What
Mhm.
does ethical leadership look like in the South African context today? You once said power without principle is barren. How do you instill principle-driven power in emerging leaders?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. What's my perception of ethical leadership currently? At worst, no, no, first, at best, it's murky. It's murky and quite troubling because uh, when it comes to ethical leadership, I think current leaders, both political and business, because when it comes to corruption, there's generally a corruptee and a corruptor. And as you may recall, companies like McKinsey, companies like KPMG colluded with government in corruption. So, yeah, my view of that leadership it's at best murky, but at worst heart-wrenching. It really leaves you very, very worried. I have written a little bit, I think, in the uh, foreword that I wrote to a book by Professor Paulo Zulu of UKZN. I lamented the fact that sequent to Zuma ascending to the presidency, we're going to go into a period of darkness. But the darkness, is something you can fight with illuminating some candle, or even something bigger than a candle. You can resort to electricity and bring about some light. But I got very, very worried as his presidency was unfolding. And I warned our compatriot that we're moving towards what is called prebendalism, which is a stage before something worse that I'll also comment on. Prebendalism is where the political leadership, actually arrogate to themselves institutions of the state and you utilize that as though, it is something that they can dish out as largesse, first and foremost to their kith and kin, and perhaps to those who sing praises to them, who are never constructively critical of them. And I saw that unfolding. So I wrote about this prebendalism in the foreword that I wrote to Professor Paulo Zulu's book. And I indicated that my worry is that in fact will degenerate to a more painful state, a more painful political economy called kleptocracy that is being led by thieves and scoundrels. And I'm afraid we're finding ourselves in that sort of area now. So my perception of contemporary leadership, both but largely political, is that, and that the leadership more often than where we thought the ascendance of the successor to Zuma was going to rescue us. It is failing dismally to rescue us. We are being led by a presidency which does not seem to have courage, particularly the courage of its own conviction. We were promised that what was happening would be stopped. That those who believe they can steal from the fiscus and from government will actually be stopped dead on their tracks. And that has remained just a promise, no follow through. So my sense is that current government has no courage, particularly courage of its own conviction, because the conviction is clearly there, but the follow through, the courage to actually implement is lacking. So that would be my perception of where we are. You followed that through with quoting me, perhaps from one of my books or from one of my speeches I keep articulating things and writing about things. Some of them are in the books, others have been in speeches. You quote me as saying that power without principle is barren. And if I remember well, I effectively said power without principle is barren, bordering on barbarism. Because without principle, you are not really different from a barbarian. If you're devoid of principle, you are substantially no different from any barbarian who has power but abuses and misuses it. So that would be my sense. And you wanted to know, what might one do to instill principle-driven power in emerging leaders, leaders like yourself, young leaders like yourself. Now, we can talk about that at some length, but I'll try to be somewhat brief and just outline what I consider to be pillars of principle-driven power. That would include ethical intentionality. So those who mean to socialize and inculcate principle-driven power must be intentional about it. They should not rely on it happening incidentally. If you're talking about curricula, they must be intentional in imbuing the curricula with prescriptions, maybe books, maybe the syllabi themselves, with principles that principles that form an integral part of the curriculum. So that would be the first thing that I would suggest be done. The second thing would be that those who are leaders, who have, for one reason or another, stepped onto some leadership plate, should insist on consistent accountability, making sure that those who we have put into political power remain answerable, even when it is somewhat inconvenient to be answerable. They must be accountable to moral and communal standards. There should be that insistence. And if that insistence is not there, we as the citizenry should insist on that being manifest. And thirdly, as a pillar, I would say that South Africa is in Africa. So we should also tap into African value system, values of Ubuntu. The insistence that the only way I find expression as a human being is amongst other human beings. I am because you are. Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. Inkosi ngabantu abamlandelayo. So those values are very, very strong at the cultural archetype level. We must bring them to the surface and insist that they form pillars of principle-driven power. And there are a number of ways to instill this in youthful leadership development. I think one of the things that we should insist on is have this embedded in our philosophical view of life. And Ubuntu is a philosophical view of life. So we should use reflections and idiomatic expressions and proverbs from African sages and some global thinkers. And in this instance, I could give you examples like Nelson Mandela, like Martin Luther King, if wanted to go international, like Confucius, if wanted to go to the East. They insisted on wholesome or ethical behavior predicated on a worldview that you could actually describe as philosophical. And we should, as elders, prompt young leaders to answer questions that are probing, not questions that say, well, geologically, what do you think? But fundamental questions like what must never be sacrificed, even in pursuit of power? If you raise that question and debated it with the youth, they might wind up actually finding their purpose in life. And I would also suggest that we should instill training that include the practice of power with purpose. And we should have case simulations of that, where we say somebody must lead us, and they purportedly give us directions to go in a given direction, but have fellow youth to quiz him or her once he has actually said, well, this is what I would actually like to suggest with this is a route I would like for us to take. And have those kinds of conversations, those kinds of dialogues, call it multi-logues if you like, would actually force leaders, young leaders like yourself, to actually do some serious introspection, some serious debating that crystallizes an ethical way forward. And well, there are a number of things that one could inculcate by way of helping the students to develop a purpose-driven life.
I just want to get into the point where you were mentioning corruption. I was just reading an interesting book called The ANC Billionaires.
The ANC?
Where Billionaires.
Mm-hmm.
So it touches on a history of how the party actually got into power, but actually sacrificed the whole black masses, because the whole introduction or whole agreement to what the public was expecting as a whole, black young South African, we were expecting that, because we were introduced into the money system in banking, but we don't know how to understand how banking really works. I want to get into your thoughts of how actually how young people which human principles should young people execute in today's era, especially young black South Africans, because we're expecting Uzuma, but they're actually funded by the business elites, if we may say, funded by all these Oppenheimers and all these big guys. Because I believe we're in a simulation. We are actually puppets being ran under the hierarchy. And I want to hear your thoughts of if South Africa as a whole has a future, especially for young black South Africans.
Yeah, I believe South Africa does have a future, and that future may be bright, and that future may be much better than the doldrums in which we find ourselves sociopolitically and economically in South Africa. But it's a future that is not going to happen as a happenstance. It will be a bright future if we make it a bright future. Your interest, for one, if, say, for instance, we had 1,000 Lingeliches, and they care about tapping into whatever wisdom there may be amongst those that indlela ibuzwa phambili, amongst those that have come before you, and build on that and make that future happen. It would happen, but it's not going to happen incidentally. You as the leaders must be intentional about it. You must not allow things to happen to you. You must actually make things happen, and if need be, happen to things. In other words, be catalytic. So the future is gloomy if you make it gloomy, particularly you, the youth. The future will be bright if you make it so. Some 3 weeks back, I actually gave a lecture in memory of Mashinini, Tsietsi Mashinini. And I had a few, instructive things to tell. And even now I'm developing that theme of, when this young man led the 1976 uprising, one could actually say it was the spirit of Africa in him, because he was fairly young. He was about 18 or 19. But I was told when I researched to give the speech, I got to know that he was an avid reader. A good number of the books that got to be read at the time was written by some guy called James Hadley Chase. They're just novels, I'm told he was reading at the rate of 3 times the rate of the average reader. So by the time he led that, in terms of intellect, he was quite developed, and deliberately and purposefully developed. So I would urge the likes of yourself and your contemporaries to actually read a great deal. We'll talk about the need to read books as opposed to, imbibing and living off sound bites from social media. That doesn't help you develop your intellect. You remember a few things, a few phrases to impress yourself and your contemporaries, your friends. But what will actually build your generation is to delve deep into what is written, or what you can get from AI if you can use it properly. But I would suggest that even before you rely on AI, read the books written by our sages. We'll talk about who have inspired me to write, who has inspired me as some kind of author. Read those, and read contemporary ones like a person like Mbeki. He has written as a political leader. He has written quite a bit. One of his best books is Africa, Define Yourself. Because if you don't define yourself, others will define you. And if you are lazy, you will end up their definition of you as the true you. And there's nothing more damaging than that. People like Tinyiko Maluleke and people like Professor Manganyi, who unfortunately perished sometime last year. These are the people who took trouble to think about our contemporary South Africa. So I would urge the youth to actually, people like Paulo Zulu. He must have written about 3 or 4 books that are very, very searching in their approach. He happens to be my friend, and therefore, I'll wax poetic about him, but he writes very well, and he cares to think. The people like myself, to a degree, I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but at age 75, I've written no less than, well, there's one manuscript which is with UNISA. That's my ninth manuscript, and they were published in 2 weeks' time. So those are some of the, I'm giving these as examples, but I believe there are many more. And much further afield in Africa, there are many more other writers. I would suggest that the contemporary youth of your age and a little older and a little younger should actually read and read hard. And I can see that you have read quite a bit.
You've served as a chairperson for major companies like Nedbank, Eskom. What are the toughest leadership lessons you've learned from boardroom crisis? You've seen on the news, Eskom corruption. It's been happening since the tenure of all these failed politician leaders we had in the past. I want to hear your lessons you've learned in dictators, in those hierarchies, in those boardroom rooms in your tenure as a chairperson.
Well, there are numerous, but perhaps we could focus on 3 or 4, given the fact that, this is a podcast. I would say the first one has to do with a sense of destiny. There are a good number of leaders that have not actually defined what their sense of destiny is, because it is from that sense of destiny that you can develop your vision, sort of the desired end state that actually beckons you to realize it as your purpose in life, as your mission in life. Vision must align with identity. And a good number of people I've learned by my chairmanship have not even tried to think about that. They just move in and talk about the content of the board packs, not rooted on a sound foundation, such as vision aligning with identity. When I became chairman of Nedbank, I confronted something of a classical example of a misalignment of vision with identity. The identity of the bank at the time was supposed to be a bank that is serious about money, a bank, a financial services company. But at the time, it was led by one Richard Lobsher, and he developed a fairly huge ego about him being CEO. And he wanted to diversify in a manner that was going to destroy the identity of Nedbank as a financial services company. He, for whatever reason, advocated to buy one of the leading legal firms and incorporate it in the bank. No one can gainsay the fact that you need legal advice, particularly when you're doing things like if you're about to buy a company, for instance, due diligence. You need financial advice, you need legal advice, but you don't need an entire huge law firm as a division in the bank. That's a classical example of vision not aligning with identity. The identity of Nedbank was one of the leading financial institutions, not financial cum legal. So that's one lesson I've learned. Second lesson is succession planning. Understanding that succession planning is strategic, not cosmetic. I was in chairing one company. A good number of my colleagues are agitated for having the incumbent CEO succeeded by a Black person willy-nilly. I was with them all the way. But come the time when we shortlisted the candidates to two, there was a huge contestation. And the Black guy had just about everything going for him. He had an MA, an MBA, he had a CA, he had a doctorate. And he had banking experience, albeit with the DFIs, development bank as opposed to commercial banks. So I mean, one could see that in fact this is the guy to go for. But once you get to shortlist to two, you delve deep, and the alternative white fellow was highly educated as well, deeply and highly experienced as well, and very ethical. And the Black guy, as we were delving deeper, we unearthed things that were so untoward about his stewardship, about how he cares for the things that he should diligently care for. And the manner in which he actually treated corporate funds as though it was money from his back pocket. So whereas a good number of us agree that the Black guy eminently qualified, but because in terms of ethical conduct, he fell flat, a good number of us on the board actually agitated for the white guy actually having ethical conduct and competency trouncing competency that might actually defraud the bank. So succession planning is strategic, not cosmetic. That would be one lesson that I believe I learned as a chairman of a major corporation. The third lesson would be operational preparedness. Operational preparedness in my book is not negotiable. If you look at the demise of Transnet, and in particular SAA, it was populated and human resourced by people who simply had no operational preparedness. I don't want to mention names, but that was my observation, and already I was sort of a critical observer, if you like, an observer who is a player at the same time. And in due course, I mean, during the presidency of one of the presidents that we were actually cursed to have, you had a chairman of the SAA who was a primary school teacher. And in my observation, may never have sold even a bag of potatoes at a profit. And he said, go and check this, this airline. I happen to have had the fortune of being a consultant to SAA when it was rated, it was amongst the top 4 in the world. And this lack of operational preparedness actually killed or destroyed an airline that at some stage was in the top 4, vying for first position with the likes of Lufthansa and Swiss Air, and then those in the Far East. So operational preparedness, in other words, qualification perhaps backed up by the requisite experience, are key, and you cannot compromise on that. Another lesson that I've learned is that boards must support the executives without overstepping. In other words, they should avoid the temptation to be executive. If you're a board, you're a board. If you're a director on the board, that's what you are. If you are a minister representing a given company as the shareholder representative, stick to that. Don't become the spokesperson for the organization, because I mean you're not equipped for that. So I would suggest, don't overstep your fiduciary responsibility as a board. It's critical. Stick to your lane. Advise as much as you can. Call the executives to book. And if they fail to deliver, fire them. Get those that will deliver. Don't, there is an expression that, in fact, there are certain board members who behave like dog masters who actually rear a dog and then proceed to bark alongside the dog. If you have a dog, a guard dog, let it bark, let it bite, not you barking and biting, because the dog does your bidding. So what I've learned is that, in fact, good boards will support the executives without overstepping their mandate. And perhaps a fourth observation that I see as a lesson would be the need to understand corporate culture and make sure that culture conflict does not become a crisis multiplier. And the lesson here is that, in fact, there are corporations, including banks, I'm not going to mention names, that failed to understand that culture matters. And directors who neglect the cultural tone during crisis generally face long-term erosion in trust and performance. There's this particular bank that historically was dominated by what you might call Afrikaans culture. And they had to heed the imperatives of transformation. But the residue of this culture scuttled what would otherwise have been a successful transformation by, in a sense, hobbling the black person that they had invited to be, the two people that were invited to be transformative, where the bank was concerned, the chief executive and the chairman. And those people allowed the relic of that particular bank's culture to surface and interfere with what would otherwise have been commendable development. So heed the fact that culture or culture conflict may be a crisis multiplier. Perhaps I should just give the last one in terms of those observations, because I think I tend to get carried away. The business leadership in any business environment must insist on accountability and understand that accountability starts at the top. There is the expression, the fish rots from the top. whoever is at the helm should make sure that the ultimate accountability is his or hers, and make sure that if there are mistakes, he owns up to the mistakes quite early and purge himself or the organization of those mistakes. Accountability in corporate leadership is key. So perhaps we can stop there.
What do you believe is Africa's greatest untapped asset? And lastly, if your life story were a book, what would be the last chapter be?
Intellectual capital is the mightiest asset that Africa does have, and have in superabundance. They just don't effectively employ it. And with that capital, intellectual capital, I believe properly harnessed, they could use technology to leapfrog into where the so-called developed economies are. Technology can be used as a leveler. But in order for you to use technology as a leveler, you must develop, first and foremost, the sine qua non to that is developing your intellectual capital. Monetary or financial capital is fine, but it can evaporate very, very quickly. But developed intellectual capital, properly utilized, will make sure that Africa develops as it should, particularly if that intellectual capital is coupled with developments in technology. And all of those can be learned very, very fast, particularly given our modern circumstances and available facilities. Now, perhaps you can find a space to put this in. The question was, if your books were required reading, what lesson would you want students to carry with them? I'll answer in perhaps 2 sentences. First, I would like for the books to enable the students to explode the notion that Africans cannot think and write, particularly on business and corporate issues. Secondly, I would like for the books to help stop rampant self-effacement and replace that with a sense of efficacy, the idea that we can, which actually propelled Obama to presidency, a sense of efficacy. If my books can help in any way, I would like for them to instill in students a sense of efficacy, the idea that we can, and mean that we can. In other words, it should not be an empty we can. It must be backed up by knowledge and knowledgeability.
Thank you so much. Ngiyabonga kakhulu, Dr. Reuel Khoza, for availing yourself today and taking your time to have this interview.
Thank you very much.